Dr. Schlumpf is professor at...
Doctor.
Well,
That's okay.
well,
I
I would call you...
care about these things.
People do care, but titles, okay.
Associate professor.
Yeah, human person extraordinaire, gift. Okay, so Heidi specializes in communications, and she's also a columnist and blogger for the National Catholic Reporter, NCR. And Heidi's going to introduce the session with Kate Hennessey. So, Heidi.
Good morning. I was so grateful to be asked to come attend this conference, and I am tweeting and writing about it for NCR at the same time. I've always identified with Dorothy Day. She's obviously a female Catholic journalist who leans to the left, just like I do. But it wasn't until I read Kate's book that I realized we also shared a love of knitting and coffee. So I'm very excited to introduce Kate. Kate Hennessey, as you all have heard already, is the youngest granddaughter of Dorothy Day and Forster Batterham. She's the youngest daughter of Dorothy's daughter, Tamar. She's a writer in her own right and has had things published before, but I will say I think this one is the book that's going to really put you on the map. The Dorothy Day, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty. I was lucky enough to listen to the book, not read it. So if anyone isn't a reader but wants to get the information, it's available on Audible. And so it was very interesting and prompted many conversations with my children who were in the car with me while I was listening to it. Like, Mom, what's an anarchist? So the book is being widely reviewed. The Chicago Reader just released a review 2 days ago and called it an antidote to trying times. The Atlantic has also reviewed it and wrote about the beautiful kaleidoscope of images in the book, and I agree with that. What I loved about the book is not just the portrait of Dorothy that it gives, but also of your entire family. So stories about your mother and about your father and all the children and everyone involved in Catholic Worker. So I think in the end you really came into some interesting conclusions about both Dorothy and your mother, and as the third generation, we're really lucky to have you here today. So I introduce to you Kate Hennessey, who's going to give us a message of hope.
Thank you. Now, I know this is titled A Message of Hope. I hope I actually can do that. We'll just see at the end. I'd like to start with just looking at this beautiful view of the water. My grandmother felt that water was sacred. All water was sacred. And so I'm also doubly appreciative of the talk about Standing Rock. There is no doubt in my mind. I'm actually kicking myself because a reporter asked me, would my grandmother be protesting against Trump? And that word Trump just sucks the air out of the room, and we forget everything else. And she would have been at Standing Rock. There's no doubt in my mind. She was very much interested. In the 70s, I don't know if you remember, there was quite a, sorry, I have a cold, so. In the 70s, there was quite a few liberation movements, and one of them was Native American. And she was very much interested and visited reservations, spoke to people. And so I think Standing Rock, both because of her interest in people's movements and also her interest in the sacredness of water, would be very compelling to her. Another thing I want to say about water is that she converted to Catholicism on the beaches of Staten Island. And she always returned to places with water I'm so sorry, I'm like losing my voice. I need some water. I need some water, speaking of water. Yes, I have one. And I just want to point to the photograph that's on the cover of my book. This is the water at Staten Island, which is where she discovered her spirituality and where she continued to return to throughout her life to rejuvenate herself. This is my grandmother. This is my mother. This is probably about 1928. And the photograph is taken by my grandfather, Foster Battram. So this is a particularly meaningful photo to me on many levels, both familial and spiritual. And also, I'd like to say I'm so grateful to be here in Chicago. I don't know much about Chicago, being an East Coast girl. I've only been here once before. But as people have mentioned before, my grandmother spent some of her formative childhood years here. And one of the things that she said that her parents would always make sure was to have them live in a beautiful spot, either near water or near a park. And she always talked about her love of the landscape in Chicago and in the area. I mean, she loved it so much. I grew up in Vermont. My parents moved to Vermont in the late 50s. And so my grandmother would come up and visit us often for a period of 20 years. And every time, or most times, she would come up to Vermont, she'd say, "Too many hills, too many trees. I feel suffocated." And because she had this great, deep love of the prairie, of the Midwest. So I just wanted to start with that because I think it's really important to ground ourselves in the landscape that we are in. And both my grandmother and my mother were very much aware and always tuned in, for lack of a better phrase, to our surrounding landscape. So I just would like to start with that. There's a few things that I want to cover. I kind of throw myself in these talks, and I never know if I actually say what I mean to say. But things seem to work out anyway. I'm really very much interested. I'm going to read a few things from the book. I want to begin with why I wrote this book. I think at this point there are about 20 books written on my grandmother. It's enough in many ways. So why this book? I want to read from the preface because that really lays out how it began for me. There's a few things I want to talk about, in tying it into where do we find hope in these times. I want to kind of bring it to the personal and talk about what I've had to learn as my grandmother's granddaughter of how to find my way through a very difficult world on many levels, particularly if you are quite sensitive to the ills and evils and the suffering of people. And I assume that everyone in this room, that is on their mind. Otherwise, why be attracted to Dorothy Day? And then I would really love it if people throw questions at me. And don't worry if they're too difficult. I've already heard some very difficult questions, and I try to answer them as best I can. But I am finding that that really is the heart of these discussions about my grandmother. One of her famous sayings is, "We were just sitting around talking," and then the Catholic worker came into being. So I think it's absolutely essential that I not just stand up here and speak, but that you throw some questions at me. So I'd like to start with reading the preface of my book. And I think my voice is surviving. In the last years of her life, my grandmother often woke up hearing her mind the words from her beloved Dostoevsky. "The world will be saved by beauty." Of all the words she wrote, of all the quotes she so loved to repeat, of all the advice and comfort she gave to countless people, in all 5 of her books and 50 years of her column, and in a lifetime of diary and letter writing, this is what has come to give me the most hope. For if after years of struggle, weariness, and a sense of deep and abiding failure, she believed in salvation through beauty, then how can we not listen? I discovered this aspect of my grandmother while reading her diaries. They were published 2 weeks after my mother's death, but it took almost a year before I could bring myself to open the book. Then, once opened, I couldn't put it down. It was as if I, dying of thirst, were given a long, cold drink from the purest of wells. And as I read, I felt a growing need to add another layer to this tale, not only to portray the grandmother I knew and her daughter, her only child, Tamar, but also to somehow bring my grandmother and mother together in ways they hadn't been able to achieve while they lived. On the morning after I finished reading, I lingered in that half-asleep state, where both dreams and reality take on a different quality altogether. That in-between state, where you sometimes hear a voice you're certain is from someone in the room calling your name. And you wake up saying, "Yes, what is it?" But no one is there. My dream is brief, as dreams of this kind are, no beginning or end, just a flash containing all I needed to know. And in that moment I felt, sure and true, the knowledge of both Tamar's and Dorothy's lives with all their experiences and memories. And I was overcome by this knowing. I felt the weight and the miracle of their lives. And I wondered if I were strong enough, wise enough to tell this story. But haven't I been working on it all my life, living in their wake and stumbling along, trying to make my own way? And isn't this my history also? One of the elements of what makes a person extraordinary, I have come to believe, is when their inner and outer lives are in accord. When what they do in the world is what their innermost being leads them to do. This is why the history of the Catholic worker is the history of my mother, the history of the relationship between my mother and grandmother, and the history of my family. The winter following my grandmother's death was bone-shivering, teeth-achingly cold, the temperature hovering between 20 and 30 degrees below zero, night after night. At the time, my mother lived with her small black dog in a hand-built cabin on the edge of the woods. She was alone and grieving, and yet she turned to me. She was 54, and I was 20. And in an effort to help us both through this dark time, she and I began a discussion about her mother. These talks were not often easy to follow. Their paths could be just as elusive as Tamar was herself. She was unfocused and uncollected. She jumped from thought to thought while I tried to follow her hints and allusions, or the sentences she couldn't bring herself to finish. Telling me her story in the grab-bag way she had, an image, a thought, a sparkle and flash of laughter, a retort of anger, regret, or loss. We continued our conversations on the first anniversary of Dorothy's death while staying at the Catholic Workers' Beach Cottage on Staten Island, New York. And then in a house in the small Vermont town of Springfield, where my mother moved from her cabin, the neighborhood rough but full of poor, working-class families, just as Tamar liked it. Again and again, we returned to this discussion and to the last weeks of her life, 27 years later. Many writers, scholars, historians, and theologians have chosen to tell the story of Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker, the movement she began in the 1930s, grounded in performing the works of mercy, and still exists today, decades after her death. But it seems to me that those who knew her best are often the ones most fearful of trying to write about her in all her complexity, richness, and contradictions. Tamar greeted each new book or film about her mother with fatalism, yet she couldn't stay away, and she couldn't keep from being disappointed. Then, when such a person as Dorothy Day is your grandmother, an examination of her life isn't an intellectual, academic, or religious exercise. For me, it is nothing less than a quest to find out who I am through her and through Tamar. It is a quest to save my own life, though I don't yet know what this means. Seamus Heaney once said that in his poetry, he wrote about those moments he sensed held greater meaning within, even though he might not ever find out what that meaning was. And I see this quest as not only for me or for my family, but for anyone who senses that greater meaning and desires to explore it. There was a group of children who grew up at the Worker in the 60s and 70s who called Dorothy Granny, as my siblings and I do, though they were not related to her, and this is as it should be. We all need to live our lives as if we are Dorothy's children and grandchildren, being comforted and discomforted by her as she invites us to be so much more than how we ordinarily see ourselves, and perhaps more important, how we see each other. Dorothy said there was never a time when she wasn't writing a book or thinking of writing a book, whereas Tamar wasn't a writer and had difficulty expressing herself in any medium. Dorothy was a talker, and my husband was too, she said. That was enough. But there did come a time when she felt the desire to write. When her father, Foster Battram, died 4 years after Dorothy, Tamar discovered in his apartment letters Dorothy had written to him in the 1920s and early 30s. In them, Tamar could finally read of the love and longing her mother felt for this silent man, so much like his daughter. In them, Tamar could once again see her mother, the Dorothy Day she so loved and who seems in danger of being lost to the world, a woman of great joy and passion, humor, and love of beauty. Tamar grieved the loss of this vibrant woman to the annals of hagiography and the desire to see her as a saint, and at times to Dorothy's own nature, especially during her severe and pious stage, as Tamar called it. In these letters, Tamar found what she had longed for: love between her mother and father, Dorothy the saint, and Foster the scientist, the two halves of her heart. And after reading these letters, she wanted to show the world this part of the story, her story. I can see the two of them in my mind's eye, mother and daughter facing each other, loving each other, challenging each other. This is the story of my life, says one. No, this is the story, says the other. Many of Dorothy's favorite quotes had to do with love. Love is the measure by which we shall be judged. And where there is no love, put love, and you will find love. Those two are from St. John of the Cross. Then there's Dostoevsky. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. But it is one of Dorothy's own quotes that I love the best. God understands us when we try to love. Tamar liked to say, all the world needs is loving kindness. Her love was of more practical nature, the words of a mother of 9 and a steward of the land. Whereas Dorothy's love had an element of mystery, a quality she needed for the life she led. Dorothy also said, we all feel alone, and we always will. She said that we struggle against both freedom and responsibility, and with these two, we always will. Tamar said, we all must live our own disasters. Agony and foolishness, she called these lives we lead. For me, these quotes of theirs reveal something of the love they gave and received, the lessons they learned, and the heroism it required, each in her own way. I don't think they ever said these words to each other, for if they had, maybe then they would have been able to understand the nature of their struggle, and maybe their intense love for one another would have been leavened by this understanding. But Tamar was unable to write her story, as Dorothy was unable to write her last book, in which it seems she wanted to make sense of this relationship between mother and daughter. And so here I am, left holding the pen, still grieving the loss of my mother, still grieving for the two of them, and led by the only thing that matters, the only thing worth writing about, love. So, 8 years later, I wrote that preface at the very beginning, and it has pretty much stayed exactly the same as I wrote it. I had no idea where this book would take me, and it has been an incredible process, not only in terms of the people I've met and spoken to, the research I have done, which was all fabulous. I really had a lovely time, beautiful, beautiful people, great archives, thank God for archivists. But really the thing that happened to me most is something that I still can't explain. And that is how, I'm going to quote myself, and this is something that Robert quoted last night, to have known Dorothy Day is to spend the rest of your life wondering what hit you. I wrote this in 1997 at the 100th anniversary of my grandmother's birth. And I don't know how I came across that sentence or how it came to me, but it has proven to be true. I think one of the things about if you're going to be influenced or if you're going to pay attention to Dorothy Day, your life will be changed. And this is as it should be. There's no point in admiring her. You have to do something. And it has been, unfortunately, my burden that when you grow up with such a powerful person, it is very hard to find your own way. There are probably two things that I have had to come to, three things, but one turned out not to be such a big issue. three things I had to struggle with in growing up following that wake, that powerful wake of my grandmother. One is voluntary poverty. Now, this probably, I thought, was the most difficult. My mother grew up very poor. She was a mother of 9. She was a single mother of 9. My parents' marriage did not last. And to me, I could not understand what voluntary poverty was and what it meant. And I resented it. I resented poverty. Turns out, that's the easy question. You know, my mother provided us with immense riches. My grandmother provided us with immense riches. And there are riches of the mind and the heart and of beauty. One of the reasons why I titled this book, The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, is not only do I believe it, but the very fact that people have to say it when they talk about my book, to me, is a continuing prayer being sent out. And this beauty doesn't matter how poor you are, unless, of course, you're destitute, and that's a whole different level. I know there was a question earlier, why isn't the Catholic worker more diverse? And I would say there are many, many people who suffer so deeply that just to get through the day is all they can manage. But for those of us who are very lucky to have a little bit more, no matter how poor we are, but to at least have a richness of spirit, poverty has turned out to be a minor incident in my growing up years. And this is something that I came to in the process of writing this book. So what I thought was a big issue, nah, it's not a big issue. There are two other issues, though, that keep unfolding for me. One of the pieces of advice that my grandmother would give to young people, saying, what do I do? How do I find my way? She said, follow your conscience. And she felt this was so profound and so sacred, she said, even if it's an ill-informed conscience. You know, it's great to have an informed conscience, but don't worry if it's not. That there is something so deeply sacred about listening to that inner voice that you had to listen to it and you had to act on it, no matter what. I think this is, I know there's been some interesting discussion around this, and I think there's a bit of distrust, that we kind of distrust that small, still voice within us. And she said, no, you know, never distrust that voice. And I really can't elaborate on that anymore because I think this is such a delicate aspect of how we try to, or how we need to discover who we are and what we're meant to do. The second thing that she talked a lot about is finding your vocation. This probably is one of the things that my mother also talked a lot about, of how essential it is to find your vocation. And your vocation doesn't have to be the Catholic worker. My grandmother was very clear. She said, this work isn't for everyone. And basically, really what the Catholic worker was at her time was a school. She often said that. People come, they spend time here, and they move on. They find out how they can work best in the world. They go to become teachers, writers, medical professionals, academics. I mean, it really, editors, that finding one's vocation is so sacred that we're doing a disservice when we choose our vocation based on things that are not in our heart. She said, how do you know your vocation? By the joy it brings you. Now I'd like to leave those at that. And I know there will be some questions about that because I think, how do we move ahead during these times? And I would say we have to start with those two questions. What is in our conscience? And what are we called to do? Where do our abilities lie? And where does our joy lie? Now, it took me many, many years to learn these things. So, and I'm still working on them. It's been a long time for me to be able to accept the fact that actually my vocation is a writer and that my vocation is not the Catholic worker. Now, my family is the Catholic worker, but it is not my vocation. So those are two things that I would love it if people would elaborate on from their personal experiences. Now, I think I would actually open up to questions at this point. I really don't like speaking too much at length, but I am more than delighted to speak at length with people's direct questions. So, Heidi?
Here, you want to keep standing?
No, I prefer to keep standing.
Okay, can people hear me? Okay, so they asked me to prepare a couple questions to get things started. And I'll go right to the question of vocation, I guess, because that really struck me as one of the main messages of the book. And I wonder how you hold the fact that so many people found their vocation at the Catholic Worker or through Dorothy Day, but yet it seemed like that was a problem with your mom. So she was not able to really discover that sense of vocation, and in part because of her relationship with her mother. I think one of the saddest sections of your book was the part where she had her IQ test late in life and discovered like 140 something.
Yes.
And thought, really? And she was surprised by that, and she had this love of science that she didn't get to pursue. So how do you hold those contradictions and tensions?
Well, my mother talked a lot about vocation for that very reason, that she felt hers was diverted. That's very, this is a very complicated story between my grandmother and my mother. They both were very deeply different people. They operated in the world differently. They thought differently. They spoke differently. My grandmother was, as I say, my grandmother was a talker. She was a fabulous talker. She was a fabulous storyteller. Beautiful, beautiful voice. My mother was silent. It was very hard for her to talk. She was incredibly shy. I mean, pathologically shy. She could not speak unless she was with people that she knew and loved. So there was this. I think there were some issues that probably that weren't recognized back then, but maybe would be better recognized now, and my mother would have been able to avail herself of a better educational system that understood her different needs. I mean, here she was, her IQ was of a genius level, but she had no way of really showing this because of her shyness. Another thing that happened is that, and my grandmother, she raised my mother according to the Day family method, which was pretty haphazard. The Days, my great-grandparents, they moved around a lot, and they put their children in different schools all the time, and they moved house all the time, and no one thought anything of it. My mother was born, and she was very different. She needed stability. She needed to be in the same house. She needed to be in the same school. And my grandmother didn't quite understand that. So there was a lot of instability, and one of the areas of instability had to do with the very first Catholic worker farm in eastern Pennsylvania. Just to put in a little bit of Peter Morin, my mother absolutely adored Peter Morin, and she very much responded to his message of getting back to the land. She responded to it when she was 8 years old. I mean, she grew up in New York City, in Little Italy, in New York City, but she wanted out of there as quickly. When she discovered dirt and animals and trees, she knew that was where she was meant to be. And so she loved the Easton Farm. The Easton Farm was bought in 1936. The work had been going for 3 years. It was their very first farming commune, and it was in existence for 11 years. But during that time, my mother was hitting her teenage years, and there was quite a few factors going on, not only because she was a teenage girl, and mothers and teenage daughters have their own, rocky times, but also it was a period that my grandmother was going through. She was doing a lot of retreats, Father Hugo retreats at the Easton Farm, in which she compelled my mother to attend. And there was a real, I kind of touch upon in the preface that my mother was losing this mother that she so loved this mother that talked about art and literature and music, and my mother was, turning 14, and she was just beginning to appreciate those things. And then it shut down because of the rigorous nature of the retreats. And so there started to be this tension. And also my mother was turning into a beautiful young woman, and she was getting a lot of attention from guys. And so my grandmother sent her off to Canada to go to school, in a convent school that spoke only French, with 1 week's preparation at the Berlitz School of Language. And this was devastating to my mother. So she felt like she was being sent in exile from the Catholic Worker, which she loved. She absolutely treasured her years growing up in the Catholic Worker. They were mighty years for her. She really felt that she learned how good the world is, and it wasn't until she moved out of the Catholic Worker that she realized how little people supported each other. So her memories of growing up at the Worker were just golden to her, and Easton was one of those golden memories. And she kept being sent away from Easton. And when she came back from Canada, I have no idea if I'm answering your question, but I'll just keep going.
I love these stories about your mother.
When she came back from Canada, she met a man, David Hennessey, who is my father. My mother was 16. My father was 29. And they wanted to marry, and my grandmother said, no, you can't get married until you're at least 18. And so then she sent her away again from the farm. Now this time it actually was a very good decision, because she sent her to, I don't know if people are familiar with the Catholic Worker artists, one of whom is Audie Bethune. My mother became an artist apprentice with Audie Bethune for a year, spent one of her happiest years of her life doing that. But then she came back. Audie had to end her school because she got sick, and my mother came back to Easton, and she married my father. As soon as she turned 18, she married my father. And this is a question that bemuses all of us, because it was clearly from the start not a good marriage. But I think what this has to do with vocation is that my mother was so strongly trying to find her own voice and to make her own decisions, and she felt that perhaps that by marrying she could actually remain at the Easton farm, and she wasn't any longer subject to her mother's decisions. And so, but what happened then, of course, is that my mother and father proceeded to have 9 babies in a period of 17 years. So, there was no chance of a vocation at that point. My mother was very much interested in the sciences. Another element, another thread of this discussion is that at that time, my mother was educated in Catholic schools. The nuns had absolutely no interest in science. And so her father tried to fill in this gap by, providing, Foster tried to provide her with chemistry sets and seeds and, things that, so my mother could, do her own experiments, do her own work. But it wasn't followed up in school. And it's one of the sad tales of aspects of my mother's life that it wasn't until Vatican II that nuns started studying the sciences. And at that point, of course, my mother was in her 40s, mid-40s. She did go back to school. She actually became a nurse. But that really wasn't her vocation either. She found it very difficult to be with people who were in such pain and suffering. I actually heard from Robert Ellsberg, I think that you're the one that told me that she wanted to be a doctor. She had never said that to any of us. So I think that was probably one of the hardest things for me to realize as I was growing up, that she really was diverted for a variety of reasons, just bad timing, bad decision making. It happens. But of course, here I am, one of the outcomes of those decisions. So I guess that's a long way of saying how she wasn't able to find her vocation.
Thank you. And on that topic, I guess, of discovering who you really are, maybe you could talk a little bit about your father, too. So there's an insight you have in this book that I don't think I had read anywhere else, so maybe is something, a newer insight about your father as well, not being who he really was. Can you want to talk about that?
Yeah, my father, a very interesting man, totally self-taught. He dropped out of school at the age of 17, but he had a phenomenal memory. I think he must have had a photographic memory. He was incredibly widely read. In 1936, he came across the Catholic Worker paper, and that's how he became interested in the Catholic Worker. It's also part of my father's very interesting nature that at the same time he was also listening to the radio shows of, that priest, that
Coughlin?
Yes, Father Coughlin, yes. A lot of anti-Semitic stuff, but, my father did back away when that started to happen. But, he was a person of many threads, and he became interested in the Catholic Worker. He had been working in the U.S. Department of the Interior as a map maker for many years, and he had an accident that did some brain damage when he was in his 20s. And at that time, he decided he heard about the Easton Farm, and he was very much interested in the Back to the Land. He was a proponent of distributism. I don't know if some of you have heard of that, but it was considered in the 30s to be a third way between the evils of capitalism and socialism. And that was kind of small ownership, small villages, people owning their own tools, owning their own, what they make. And so I loved this idea. Now, unfortunately, my father was more of a man of ideas than practicality, and being on a farm really didn't suit his purpose. And also, the Catholic Worker was a bit too radical for him. He was more conservative. But when he decided to leave the worker, he met my mother and fell in love. And so they got married. And unfortunately, one of the the difficulties of this story is that my father was totally unsuited to being married and having children. One of the reasons was he was profoundly alcoholic, but this was only a symptom, and this is only something that it wasn't at the heart of his difficulties. Now, there was a very difficult question earlier on in one of the previous panels of what. How do you? I can't remember the exact wording, but it has to do with sexuality. And when, of course, I hear that, I hear the church's teachings on homosexuality. My father was in love with a man when he was very young, and he was an extremely devout Catholic. And this separation between what was in his heart and what he was taught broke him. It literally broke him. And, of course, the marriage couldn't last under that. Now, I want to say, this is also a very complicated story. I mean, he deeply loved my mother and loved her until his death. He lived to the age of 93. But this was something that he could not, as a devout Catholic, he could not bridge that gap of what he was being told and what he felt. And he died believing that he was going to hell. So that's the tragedy of my father. And this is one of the reasons why my mother left the church. She could not exclude people in that way. She could not damage people in that way. And to her, it was a relief to let that aspect of the church go.
Thank you. I just have one more question, and then we can open it up to the group as well. So in reading some of the reviews of the book, and also in writing a brief piece about this about this symposium for NCR, quickly people in the comments started discussing Dorothy Day as a mother and whether she was a good mother or not. And then also debating whether this was even a fair question or not. Would it be asked of a man, for example? And I read a piece by Jim Martin, the Jesuit from America, who said your book really was surprising to him in that he saw Dorothy as an imperfect, or even I think he said indifferent, mother. And I was just wondering obviously your answer is in the book. I think you have some really great descriptions of what kind of mother she was and what kind of mother your mother was. But I was just wondering what you think of this whole conversation and this analysis of your family as some sort of way of getting at who Dorothy Day is, and especially since she's up for sainthood and apparently everything can be analyzed then.
Right. Well, indifferent, I think, is such an unfair word. And I'm quite surprised that Jim used that word. Indifference is not in my grandmother's fiber of being. There's just, yeah, there's not one molecule of indifference for anything in her. You know, the relationship between mother and daughters, well, yeah, there's a lot of heads nodding. Very complicated.
And Jim is neither a mother or a daughter.
Their relationship was so deep that in many ways I consider it the primary relationship for my mother. That their relationship was deeper than her marriage and deeper than her relationship with her children. Now, it's a testament to my mother's ability to love that I never felt anything but intense love from her. So this says, I'm trying to say a lot in very inadequate words, the quality of their bond. Now, a lot of people have judged my grandmother on her lack of mothering skills, but this has nothing to do with the Catholic worker. You know, it's nothing to do with my grandmother's vocation, though there were times in which her speaking took her away, and my mother had to be, the gap would be filled by certain people at the Catholic worker. And also, my mother went to boarding school, which was full. My mother would say, well, the boarding school was full of single parents. I mean, that was not unusual. So there was that profound separation of, and also, you know, as I mentioned, when she was sent up to, my mother was sent up to Canada, this kind of sense of exile from her family. And I think those were probably the most difficult aspects. Even you know, I can't say my grandmother ever understood my mother. You know, they were very different. My grandmother, she understood people who talked and wrote and you know, were out there in the world, and that was not my mother at all. So I think there was this basic misunderstandings of what mattered to my mother, what my mother needed. But it was all worked out. You know, there were some things that lingered in the final years of their life, but they talked about them. You know, they didn't really solve things. I mean, there was the most lingering difficulty was the question of my mother's education. You know, my mother felt that she was never educated to the level of what she should have been educated to. So, you know, in terms of the mothering, again, I have to bring in the Day family method of raising kids. You know, my great-grandfather believed that, well, certainly with the boys, with his sons, not with his daughters, but with his sons, as soon as you turn 15, you're out. You're making your own way. You know, go off to it and don't look to me for help. And that kind of, I think that, that those kind of strands, you know, continued a bit. That, you know, that though in practical sense, my grandmother helped my mother out all the time. And we grew up knowing my grandmother very well because she would come up and help out all the time. You know, not only in terms of finances, but in terms of her time. She spent 4 months helping to raise me when my mother was in nursing school. So there was this incredible, heroic, this is the only way I can put it. And, well, this is how, I'm quoting my mother. My mother said that Dorothy's sense of family was heroic, and that there are very few people who were just as involved in the public arena that you could say was as involved as Dorothy was with her family. Not only with us kids, not only with Tamar, but with her siblings, with her nieces and nephews, with the whole wider Day family. So, all right, my grandmother wasn't very good in terms of child psychology, knowing the stages of, you know, how to help my mother, but she did the best she could, and they both survived it. And I think they not only survived it, but they have added something, I think, their relationship. And I hope that this book does this, that they have added something to this whole conversation of what it means to be family and what it requires of each other and the heroism it requires from each other.